Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the camera that pretty much broke the internet, at least from a photography perspective. The new Fujifilm X100VI, or the Mark VI version of this series, has really kind of taken the photography world by storm. From the moment it was announced, there have been issues with scalping and orders having to be canceled, lottery systems in different places to allow people to have a fairer process of acquiring one, instant sellouts, and basically sitting at the top of sales charts in countries all around the world. So what is it about Fuji's latest iteration of the X100 series that has created so much excitement? Now, admittedly, I'm new to the X100 series, so maybe some of you who have owned past iterations of the camera can answer that question a little better than myself. But my personal take after having spent time with the X100VI is that it offers a lot of the vibe of a Leica M rangefinder body, except for with a price tag of about $1,600 rather than $9,000. It has a very stylish, retro-inspired body and control scheme. It has a fixed 23mm, or essentially a 35mm equivalent, angle of view lens, and is perhaps the best embodiment of Fuji's fantastic color science. But is the X100VI all hype, or does a solid camera hide underneath all of the hipster trappings? That's what we're here to discover in today's review, right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
Now, while this camera looks very, very similar to previous versions, there are some key upgrades underneath the hood, so to speak. We have the same, basic camera style, same lens that we've seen recently, but we have upgraded to Fuji's 40 megapixel sensor. It now, for the first time, has in-body image stabilization, 6 stops worth. They've added the X Processor 5, which allows for the AI machine learning and ability to recognize and track subjects. There are new film simulations that have been added in here, up to 20 total now available, and vastly improved video specs as well, up to and including 6.2K video capture and 4K at 60 frames per second. So some key upgrades along with some smaller upgrades along the way. I found it interesting when I was reading Fuji's marketing, as I tried to get a sense for the camera, that they use the word indulgent as a part of their marketing. That's not a word I often hear camera manufacturers use, but it does refer to the fact that this is a camera that oozes a lot of style and very obviously desirability at this point. It does have a very stylish machined aluminum body with very classic retro stylings, along with that, underneath that, the black grip that looks so much like some of my classic SLRs. That carries over to the control scheme, which uses a lot of classic inspired dials as a part of the overall vibe of the camera. And as we're going to see, that's for both good and ill as a part of it. You can get it in a more traditional black finish, but I vastly prefer this very stylish silver finish that looks really, really fantastic. So as mentioned, obviously the goal here is to have not quite a pocketable camera, but as compact a camera as possible. And with that, there does come some compromises when it comes to the overall ergonomics here. This is the kind of camera, because the grip itself is just a little bit of a bulge on the right side of it. It's a camera that I more pinch rather than able to actually grip and wrap my hands around. It's not tall enough to have room for someone with larger hands like myself to have room for the pinky finger to fit. And so for me, it's not necessarily an incredibly comfortable camera to hold. You may look cool holding it, but there's always a little bit of a feel like it doesn't mold into my hand and or my fingers don't kind of mold around the grip itself. In terms of those dimensions, the camera is 128 millimeters in width, 5 inches. It is 74.8 millimeters in height, 2.9 inches, and just 55.3 millimeters in depth, 2.2 inches. And remember, that is including a fixed lens here. The lens is constant here. This is not an interchangeable lens camera. The weight is reasonably substantial at 521 grams. That's 1.1 pounds. But remember, it's not just the all-metal body that we've got here. It's the fact that there is a lens permanently attached to it. And that weight also does include both the battery and the memory card as well. Now, as mentioned, there is a classic control scheme here, and some of that I like. It's familiar to me from cameras like their XT series, though with a few added quirks that does introduce a bit of a learning curve if you're not familiar with the X100 series. I mean, I've reviewed at this point dozens and dozens of cameras, including 12 previous Fuji cameras. And so I typically know where things are on a Fuji camera, but I did have moments where I had to figure out how different functions worked because the control scheme is a little bit unique. Probably the weirdest and the wackiest part of that is the largest dial on the camera, which is the top-mounted combination shutter speed and ISO dial. It took a while for me to figure out that the way to control that ISO there is a very quirky grabbing this ring, popping it up, and then you can rotate it underneath, and so that you can control the layer underneath it, which has very, very little resistance, no clicks or anything, so you're definitely going to want to pop that back down, because otherwise you could easily move it. It's a bit of a weird control scheme, and frankly, this whole control dial, I think you could do away with. I don't know how many people actually want to control their shutter speed from a dial, particularly when you consider you're only able to access full stops there. So that means you're going to end up with a lot more either over or underexposed images, because your typical means of controlling your shutter speed is in 1/3 stop increments, allowing for a lot of extra precision. Outside of that, there are other controls here, a little bit more traditional, including an exposure compensation dial, which I always appreciate. There is a little bit of a rocker dial around the shutter button, which allows the on and off. And then there are the control wheels front and back. A little bit of a different control here that surrounds a button, and it's a rocker style left or right. It allows you to add different functions there, up to and including the ability to do your zoom function and or to switch in between the optical or the electronic viewfinder, which is something that is unique to me in Fujifilm cameras. The fact that you can switch between those two very quickly. And there is interesting, you have the option there of having in the optical viewfinder to also have an electronic overlay with some different aspects there that make it interesting and I think fun to use in many cases. Now that viewfinder itself is a 0.5 inch opening. It is a 3.69 million dot resolution EVF. So, a little bit better than say what you're going to find on a Sony A7C, but nothing that's, really fantastic there either. Really kind of the headline here is that optical viewfinder. The fact that you can actually see right through a viewfinder even with the camera turned on is somewhat unusual in the age of mirrorless cameras. Other controls are attached to the actual lens itself. There is an aperture ring here, but because of being such a low-profile pancake-style lens, that aperture ring is actually not easy to access. I found it that I preferred to go ahead and switch aperture onto one of my control dials, and so that I could control it from there rather than trying to do it from the actual lens itself. There is a control ring on the lens itself. Obviously, the primary function would be for manual focus, but if you're using autofocus, you can also use other functions there, kind of like the control dial on Canon RF lenses. And so, like the default function there, if you're in autofocus mode, is it does allow you to switch into the digital teleconverter options, and so that you can zoom in to have a little bit tighter a framing. So, just to give you an idea of what your resolution points in, at 35 millimeters, which is the standard view, that's full frame equivalence, the 40 megapixels. If you do the first zoom in or digital teleconverter setting, it goes to a 50 millimeter angle of view. and that gives you a 20 megapixel overall resolution. If you zoom on into 70 millimeters, you drop down to 10 megapixels, but obviously a tighter framing yet. Now, I will note that this only affects JPEGs. If you get raw images, even if you shot a sequence of those, as I did, trying to test framing on my test chart, you'll find that you actually have 3 identical raw files. Unlike Leica, there are no crop marks on the raw images. This is really more about doing things in camera in JPEG. Now, interestingly, there is an integrated flash here, just a little rectangle at the front of the camera, which they can do because there is a fixed lens here. Although I think that if you add the lens converters to there, particularly the telephoto one, you probably are going to introduce some shadow into that. I don't love on-camera flashes, but more interesting here is that it can be used and set up in command mode, and so that you can use it as a master to control off-camera flashes. So that is an interesting application of that. I find that when trying to change up controls from, for example, not wanting to use that the clunky shutter speed / aperture, needing to set that up, I found that it was a little bit unnecessarily complicated. Again, I'm very familiar with setting up cameras, including Fuji cameras. I found that I had to fool around things for a little bit because the relationship between auto mode and then command mode gets a little convoluted here. There's also no mode dial here, and so say if I wanted to switch from AV mode to manual mode, I have to make multiple changes here. It's not that I can just select manual mode and there's an automatic kind of handoff, so to speak, of the various control schemes here. And so again, the ergonomics here I don't actually love myself. Because there is no mode dial, the drive button in the back, interestingly, serves kind of as that function. That's where you access things like bracketing or panorama. Even your movie mode is accessed through there. And so obviously you don't have a completely separate control scheme set up for movie mode. It has to be accessed there. Now, the touchscreen on the back is a tilting. They have expanded a bit the tilting range. It's still, somewhat limited, but a little bit more than what was available before on the X100 series. It is a 3-inch, 1.62 million dot resolution touchscreen. Unfortunately, I have yet to see, I started reviewing Fuji products at the X-T3 level. I've yet to see any improvements to their touchscreens, unfortunately. They're still not as responsive as the competition. You can't navigate menus outside of the Q menu with them. I would love to see some improvement to the touchscreen functionality here. Other controls are pretty conventional, and obviously you can assign custom values to it. There is a little bit of a joystick that helps with navigation. On the right side of the camera, there is actually the port that has a couple of connection ports here, including a combination mic input, also a remote shutter release, both in that 3.5 millimeter jack. There's USB-C here that can be used for communication and or charging battery and camera. There is a micro USB output. The other side of the camera actually has the very useful switch. In this case, it's a switch for manual focus, continuous autofocus, or single shot mode. As you probably figured out, the card slot is on the bottom. And the really unfortunate thing here with the upgrade to 40 megapixels and higher resolution video is it's still not just only an SD card slot, it is a UHS 1 only compatible. So UHS 2 offers up transfer speeds up to 3 times faster than UHS 1. Really unfortunate here because that does have a practical slowdown of buffer depth, as we'll see in just a moment. Battery pack is unchanged here. It is still the NPW126S battery pack. It is rated for 450 shots here at kind of optimal settings, and it can drop down to a little over 300 depending on the mode that you're using. Biggest kind of limitation here is if you're wanting to shoot 4K video at the higher specs, the battery will last for about 45 minutes, which is not very long. You're probably going to want to get a spare or two. This is the first of this camera series to allow direct upload to the cloud from the camera itself, which is obviously a useful function there. As noted earlier, it does come with an in-body image stabilization system. And, some people thought, you thought maybe it would be a lens-based stabilization. Instead, it's a camera-based stabilization. I'm not sure what the practical difference is, considering you're only ever going to use one lens here. So whether they did it through the lens or through the camera body, I don't think that it really made much of a difference, but they were able to miniaturize it and make it work here. So kudos to them on that. And I mean, practically, because there's only one lens, you can very quickly do the math as to what 6 stops should come out to, which would be over a slower than 1 second shutter speed. I don't think that too many people are going to successfully handhold a second or more. In my test, I was able to get a keeper rate of about 20%, going back to about 5 stops at a half-second shutter speed. I was able to get, and so, I mean, it works reasonably well, but my experience with lens-based stabilization or camera-based stabilization, that you tend to get more dramatic-looking results at telephoto distances for the simple reason that there is a practical limit. If that shutter is open for a while, there's going to be some camera movement, and there's only so much that a stabilization system can do to prevent that. And in this case, it's good. I also found that it was good for doing video work, if you're doing static shots, if you're doing slow moving shots where you're moving around. However, if you try to walk with it, it still is going to give you some clunky results when you try to walk shooting video. Now, an unfortunate omission to the upgrades here is the fact that we still have an incredibly convoluted process to get a full weather sealing. Obviously, the camera is weather sealed at all of the points, save the lens itself. So the easy fix to that would seem to be creating a weather sealed lens. That's still not what Fuji has done. You have to remove the front kind of flange, unscrew that. You have to screw on an adapter, and then you need to screw on a filter on top of that to complete the sealing. That creates a number of complications, not to mention unnecessary additional expense. By the time you buy this adapter and a filter, if you want to get the Fuji adapter or Fuji filter that matches the camera, you're in about another right under $100 US additionally in price. It also means that things like the case here, it actually doesn't fit quite as well. You have to cram it in a little bit because it's really designed for the bare lens, not the lens with the weather sealing attachment to it. It also means that if you're going to use one of the converter lenses, you're going to have to unscrew that assembly because this needs to thread on into the same place. And it also means that without buying that adapter, you can't actually use filters at all here. And I'm actually not a big fan. Your mileage may vary. I'm not a big fan of using protection filters myself. If I'm going to throw a filter on there, it needs to be serving some function because you're adding an additional glass element and additional complications that can come with that glass element. I find, for example, I'm far more likely to get smudges and fingerprints on a filter because of the process of mounting them than I am on lenses themselves. All of that obviously can impact your overall image quality. The other kind of quirky thing about the case, and by the way, the accessories from the previous generation all work here. I do appreciate that. The case itself, it does add a very retro looking, cool factor that again looks like some of my classic SLRs. Unfortunately though, this design is kind of a two-part design to where the two pieces don't actually attach together. And so when you go to actually shoot, and by the way, again, because I have that weather sealing on, it's not a comfortable fit. I have to really stretch everything to try to get the rear button to click into place. I can eventually do it. You can see looking at the side that everything is not seating quite right with that weather sealing on there. But to my current point, to actually take a photo, you've got to pull that off and then remove it because it doesn't attach anywhere to the lower half of the case. So that means that with one hand, very likely you're going to be holding onto this or dropping it on the ground or trying to fit it in a pocket, but it's not all that small, and trying to take a photo with the other hand. I'm sure that some people love the case. I look at it as being somewhat impractical myself. I will give you a bit of a breakdown during our optical sequence, looking at what happens when you attach the converter lenses. One of them switches the view to a little bit wider an angle of view, and so going from a 23mm adapting down to a 19mm, plus the crop factor then. And then the telephoto adapter changes from a 23mm angle or lens here to a 33mm, so a little bit more of a telephoto, closer to a 50mm angle of view. And so, I mean, there's some clunkiness about that too that we'll come back to when we look at that. These cost you about $350 a piece, by the way. So I would say in conclusion, when it comes to the build and the design here, the camera obviously looks really cool. It has that kind of it factor. There's no question about that. So the retro style and the retro controls does make it look very cool. Hipster, but it also compromises ergonomics at times. And so there's some give and take when you go retro. So how about autofocus? The autofocus system is essentially the same as what we've been seeing for about 3 generations of Fuji cameras. It's still the basic, combo hybrid of contrast and phase detect AF that works fairly well, though not as good as what the leading competing brands do. And I would say that at this stage, I would say that autofocus is still the weak link, in my opinion, of the whole Fujifilm system, no matter what camera you're talking about. But what has been added here is the X Processor 5, which does add on the AI deep learning for tracking. It does make the system work better than it ever has before. Now, obviously, in this case, you really can't separate the performance of the camera and its autofocus system from the actual lens and its own AF system inside, because this is the only lens you'll ever use on this camera. And so I found in doing my test that autofocus speed is about average. It's not blazingly fast. This is obviously not a linear motor because the focus motor has a bit of a scratchy feel to it. It's not silent in operation. And you'll see the focus speed is fairly good, but there's a little bit of kind of a double clutch where it hits and then it kind of resets to make sure that it focuses locked there. And so it doesn't have as much absolute confidence as what the better lenses and better focus systems working together are able to achieve. And so for stills, I found that it got the job done. We used it in a wedding ceremony and just some street photography, different things. And I found that autofocus worked, it worked well, it got the job done, but definitely not top tier in terms of my experience. Your shutter speed here it's going to depend on the actual method that you choose. And so the mechanical shutter has upper burst limit of 11 frames per second. The actual shutter speed is capped off at 1/4000th of a second, which, by the way, this top dial, that's as high as it will go, is to 1/4000th of a second, which is kind of weird because if you shift into the electronic shutter, you can get up to 20 frames per second in burst, though, by the way, with a 1.29 times crop. If you want no crop connected there, you can shoot up to 13 frames per second, but the shutter speed limit is 1/18,000th of a second, which means you actually can't control that fully from this upper based dial. I really like Fuji's kind of hybrid approach setting that you can do where you can choose to have the mechanical shutter up to a certain shutter speed limit, and then it will switch automatically into the electronic shutter if you need a faster shutter speed. It's very, very useful in real world use. Now, obviously, you have pretty good burst speed here, but it is really limited by the buffer depth, which of course is constrained by the write speed of that UHS-1 card and card slot. And so that means that your buffer depth, if you're shooting RAWs, is limited to just 17 images. And so that's going to give you barely over a second, or if you're shooting at the 20 frames per second, it's going to be less than a second of kind of space to capture your action before the buffer fills. If you switch to lossless compressed RAW, it'll increase to the mid-20s. If you go up to a full lossy compressed RAW, you'll get up to the mid-30s. And then with JPEGs, it's between 80 and 146, depending upon the burst speed that you choose. And so this is fine for capturing small bursts, but this is not a sports camera. Think of it more as a means of, if you're shooting a street or shooting a wedding, to be able to kind of shoot off a burst so you capture the perfect facial expression or the, freezing the movement of a subject, but don't think of it as a sports camera. For video purposes, I found that the video focus pulls were fairly smooth. There is a little bit of visible stepping, but a fairly consistent and smooth process. But I didn't find that it was always confident or initially accurate. It would arrive at a destination, but you could tell it wasn't quite there, and so it would readjust and get things right. So obviously that does impact the overall kind of presence of being in the shot. If the focus moves around a bit, you're going to see that and be kind of disconnected from what the person is trying to convey through the video footage itself. When I did my hand test to a test between going from the eye to the eye being blocked, I found that it's not as responsive as what I would like, and so even though I was fairly deliberate, there were times I moved my hand and I moved my hand back and it still hadn't completed that transition, and so it needed a little bit more time than what I was giving it, even moving slowly. There is some apparent focus breathing, as you might have noticed. It's not severe, but it is present. So overall, focus is a bit of a mixed bag. It is better than what has been in the X100 series before, but it's still not top tier in overall performance. As noted, video is improved here. We can now do up to 6.2K internal with 10-bit recording or color depth, which is great. Now, if you're going to shoot at 6.2, it does come with a crop factor. It's a 1.23 times crop factor. You can also shoot at 4K 60, and so you have the ability to slow down your footage later on. That has a very mild 1.14 times crop. You probably won't notice that too much. If you want zero crop, full frame readout, you're going to need to shoot at 4K 30 here. You can also shoot up to 240 frames per second in full HD if you want to really do slow motion footage. There's upgrades here as far as the ability to now shoot in f-log2. You've got HLG for high dynamic range type footage. And so you've got, some decent codecs and options here for the kind of video that you can shoot. And as noted already, the addition of in-body image stabilization dramatically improves your ability to get run and gun footage with this camera in a way like never before. I think this is a better hybrid camera than what the X100 series has ever been before. We'll talk for a moment about the lens performance, since that is connected to the overall camera performance in a unique way with a fixed lens like this. As noted, it is a 35mm equivalent focal length. There is some mild distortion and moderate vignette, a little bit of pin cushion distortion in the lens, and about 2 stops of vignette. Both of those things are impacted if you use the converter lenses, however, more on that in just a moment. There is some mild fringing of both the longitudinal and lateral varieties, nothing too severe, however. I found in testing the resolution, obviously this lens is the same lens that was on the last generation of camera, and so rather than having to face 26 megapixels, it now has to resolve 40 megapixels, which on an APS-C sensor like this, that's equivalent of over 90 megapixels of full frame resolution. That's a lot of demand on a lens, and the lens mostly is able to handle it. I found that the center is fairly good, wide open. Contrast is a little bit lacking. There is a fairly consistent drop-off as you move across the frame to the corners, with the corners being considerably softer than the center of the frame. I found that contrast really improved when stopping down from f2 to f2.8. So if you want more pop to your images, that mild stop down to f2.8 makes a huge difference. I did find, however, when stopping on down to f5.6 to f8, probably optimal range across the frame, the corners never really get pin sharp. And so if that's a priority for you, they get acceptably sharp, but never like really sharp. Diffraction will start to set in because resolution is higher. Diffraction starts to set in at about f8, but becomes more noticeable by f11 and considerably more noticeable by f16. The bokeh from the lens itself is okay. In some settings it looked fine. In other settings it got a little bit busy. You can get fairly close and get a decent level of magnification out of the lens. And obviously that helps you to have a more blurred out background. But the quality of the background blur itself is okay, but it's not exceptionally good. I found that adding on the wide converter lens added a lot of barrel distortion and a tremendous amount of vignette. Quantity of vignette almost doubled adding this on. I also found that it really softened the image. Adding on the telephoto lens converter adds a little bit of distortion, but a considerably more amount of vignette. A little bit less vignette than this, but at very high levels to where I had to almost max out the sliders to correct for it. I also found, however, that this did not soften the image at all, but rather, if anything, things looked just as sharp, if not sharper with it attached. So a thumbs up on that point. Now, as far as the sensor performance and the lens performance, I will have a deep dive breakdown at the end of the video if you're interested in that. So I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of the overall sensor performance. If you're not familiar with this 40 megapixel sensor, you can find a deeper dive by either checking out my text review or also looking at the video reviews of the X-T5 or the X-H2, which both have the same sensor, and I've reviewed them in detail before. This sensor is the highest level of resolution on an APS-C body that is currently available, and it's very useful in a situation where you have a fixed lens. It means that 23mm lens has much more room now for cropping or using that digital teleconverter. I would say that unless you're really desperate, I would skip the actual lens converters. If you want multiple lenses, then buy an X-T5 and have access to a full range of lenses. These are not, in my opinion, going to compare to a dedicated lens that covers that focal length, and they aren't really all that much cheaper either. And so I would go with a different camera if that's really what you want to do. But having the ability to deeply crop means that as a street camera, you have a lot of extra options for framing, as a portrait camera, etc., etc., landscape, all of those things. So that resolution is very, very useful. The dynamic range here is not at the top of the heap, but it certainly is competitive, and Fuji helps things out that if you shoot in the DR200 or DR400 mode, DR200 is available at ISO 250, and DR400 is available at ISO 500. But what those allow you to do is it opens up to where you're actually sampling your highlight information from the lower base resolution or base ISO level, whereas you're sampling shadow information from your current ISO setting. So it gives you a lot of additional latitude for recovering highlights and shadows as a byproduct of that. And so that can be a really useful hack if you want more dynamic range. And if you want more on that, again, check out those reviews that I've already mentioned there. The ISO performance is really pretty strong here. Those of you that are coming from the 26 megapixel sensor, I think will be fairly pleased with how well Fuji has managed to dramatically increase the resolution while keeping the high ISO performance level just almost on par with the 26 megapixel sensor. It doesn't mean that it's flawless, and certainly through ISO 3200 things look great. A little bit worse at 6400, and then the native limit at 12,800. There is some visible noise there, but particularly if you're wanting to shoot like an acros and you're shooting monochromes, it still looks really, really fantastic. And it's really in that latter point, it is these film simulations and the ability to tweak them in camera for both photos and video that really, I think, is where the magic happens. This is a camera that I think above all is for people that really love the ability to get photos that they love in camera and to be able to tweak that and customize the looks to get exactly what they're looking for. And this camera gives you a tremendous amount of custom ability to be able to accomplish that. And if you love to shoot JPEGs, I think that the JPEG engine here is fantastic. It will allow you to really get great looking images right there in camera. One unfortunate thing on that front is while you can create custom recipes both for stills and for videos, they don't seem to translate over. So you're going to have to recreate those looks for video or over in stills if you're wanting to match the look of photos and video. What's interesting here is that the built-in film simulations, they don't, if you're bringing in the raw images, they are not embedded in the raw image. And of course, in the raw images, you have the ability to select any of the film simulations in post, all of them in post, and add them at that point. However, if you're customizing a look and then shooting it in RAW, even the RAWs themselves will have that information embedded because you don't have the ability to just instantly recreate that look in post. So that's interesting there. And I will have to say before I move on from this that what I love, I think above all else from Fuji, I do like the new Reala Ace film simulation. I think that's a really good one. But I love their various acro settings. I think that the monochromes you're getting out of Fuji is, for me, pretty much top tier. I really, really love the look of them, the overall just cleanness and pop of them. And so I love it for monochrome work. So in conclusion, there's actually nothing really unique here in terms of the hardware, the sensor, the autofocus system, even the color science. You can get all of these things in other cameras, but I think it's very obviously the packaging of the X100VI that appeals to certain purists who want simplicity and want their capture process to be about the photos rather than about the gear. And clearly, Fuji has tapped into a large and maybe a growing market of people that really love the idea of the X100 series. And of course, I think that people don't mind looking cool while doing it. It's kind of ironic to me in that they're kind of using a lot of film era design cues here, but in all of their marketing, it's not people that shot film back in the day, but rather it's all, you know, young hipsters in their 20s walking around looking very stylish while using this camera. And so that really, I think, kind of shows what the marketing is about. This is designed for people who are willing to spend money on something they consider to be desirable and love it despite its limitations for the look of using it, what they can produce using it, and maybe the way that they look while using it as well. This is an extremely capable camera, but it's no more so than what an X-T5 is for a similar price, for example. But I think that what Fuji has managed to do is to distill a lot of the Leica M rangefinder goodness into a camera that has a similar appeal, but is at a fraction of the price. And if that happens to suit you, then get in line and hope that someday one of these becomes available for you. If you want more information, you can check out my full text review that is linked in the description. It's long, it's detailed, there's a lot of data there. And beyond that, if you want a deeper dive into some of the sensor and optical performance, stay tuned and we'll do the optical deep dive right after this.
So first of all, a quick look at the different framing options you're going to get if you use the original lens versus the converter with the wide angle, and then if you switch to the telephoto lens converter. So you can see you've got some fairly significantly different framing options, though obviously getting there is not quite the convenience of using a zoom lens. Now, if we turn off the corrections, here is what we get in terms of vignette and distortion. You can see that there is a little bit of pincushion distortion, just a little bit of a squeeze up that way, and then some heavier actual vignette in the corners. My correction here is a -3 to correct for the distortion, and then about a 53 in the corners to correct for the vignette. So a little less than 2 stops, or right around 2 stops, nothing too severe there. If you add on the wide angle lens converter, however, you introduce a lot of barrel distortion, as you can see here, and then also a more significant amount of vignette. So you can see that trying to manually correct it. Now, I will say that the correction profile does a fairly good job. You can see that without that profile, it doesn't correct perfectly. It's not completely linear, the distortion pattern. But the amount of vignette here is like a +95, so a really significant amount of vignette. So if you throw on the tele lens converter, you'll get instead of the barrel distortion, you get a fairly heavy pincushion distortion here, about a +13 to correct for it. Very slightly less vignette, though still a very significant amount, about a +90. So 3 or 4 points less, but still a lot to correct for. In this case, the correction's a little bit more linear, and so I could get a pretty clear looking result after manually correcting it. Now, the ability to deeply crop the 40 megapixels of resolution is incredibly useful here. So take this shot, for example. It was shot from towards the back, and so 23 millimeters doesn't get you really close enough to the action, but the ability to deeply crop in and still have good resolution. If you tried to crop in like this on a iPhone, for example, indoors, your resolution would look like mush, but you can see that there's still nice clarity and detail there even after a deep crop. In fact, right here we're at 100% of a crop. Now, before I give you a chart test, kind of torture test, I want to give you some real-world perspective. And so here at f2, you can see shooting through the window. This is real ace here as far as the look. You can tell that there's very, very nice detail. I mean, even on 40 megapixels, everyone would be happy with that as an end result. This shot also at f2, this is an Acros monochrome here, and you can see that even though this lens doesn't have amazing contrast up close, everything is, I think, acceptable for most purposes. Stopping it down a bit, and we can see that at a pixel level, there's a lot of information there. I mean, obviously, this is a big scene with lots of detail, and we can see as we work towards the edges, this is f7.1, that while the edges may not be flawless, they really look pretty good. And so looking here at the other side, you can see that, I mean, this is a perfectly useful image, even at 40 megapixels. No one would have too many complaints about that. So going to the chart here at 200% magnification, you can see that contrast is okay, fairly good in the center of the frame, and detail is fairly good. Mid-frame is still looking pretty good. As we scroll down towards the corners, however, you can see that the corner resolution is okay, but not exceptional. And so you can see that there's a bit of a drop-off towards the corners. From f2 to f2.8, you can see that there's a pretty dramatic improvement of the contrast, in particular in the center of the frame. The detail looks much better as an end result of that. Mid-frame is also looking better, and the corners, you can see there's a little bit of contrast improvement, but as is going to be a trend, you can see that as far as the actual detail radically improving, it just isn't happening. Now, to give you some real-world perspective, here's f2, here's f3.6, same scene here, and you can see if you compare these two sides, just how much more contrast there is. And so the fine textures of the grass underneath the frost crystals, it just pops on the right side, whereas the left side, we're left with a little bit of softness. Of course, the trade-off here is that there's more defocus, the background's a little more nicely blurred, obviously at the wider aperture. So at f4 and f5.6, we're hitting pretty well peak here in terms of optical performance, looking really sharp and a little bit better at f5.6. We can see that that carries off not quite to the corners. You can see that they are improved, coming back here for a moment. Improved, but not great yet, and that is fairly true. We can see it's better looking actually up here in the left corner and up here in the right corner. It's okay, but it's not exceptionally sharp. Now after f8, you'll start to see the effects of diffraction. So if we take a look here in the center of the frame, you can see we're starting to get softer at f11 and softer still at f16 due to diffraction. So as noted previously, adding on the wide angle converter here, which gets you to 19 millimeters, it has a pretty unfortunately significant softening effect, at least in the version that I used. And so I can really see a pretty high reduction of contrast. Everywhere that I look, the image is softened. I can stop things all the way down to f5.6, and as you can see, it's still not as sharp or high contrast as what the original or bare lens is wide open at f2. Now, interestingly, that's not really the case when you add on the tele lens converter here, and so it gives you a 33 millimeter angle of view. You can see that looking in the center of the frame, you know, the contrast actually looks a tiny bit better with the lens converter on there. It's, you know, right here I would say I would probably favor the bare lens. And to the corners, you can see that there's some reduced contrast, but when you stop down, there's actually a much more radical improvement in the corners at f2.8 with the teleconverter attached than what there is with the bare lens. It's kind of an oddity that I've not really seen before. Over on this side, again, the further you get away from center, the more improvement I think that there is relative to what you see from the center performance. So I would say what happens when these optics are added is that maybe you lose a tiny bit of center performance, but you actually gain when it comes to the corners of the frame, which definitely look better. So as noted previously, you can get a reasonable amount of defocus if you get close to your subject, but you're going to find that the bokeh quality, it never gets like creamy as in a premium lens is going to accomplish. There's a little bit more edging than what I would like, sometimes a little bit more busyness. And so bokeh quality is good, but it's not great. Finally, just a couple of sensor observations. So in this shot, you've got a lot of dynamic range. Obviously, you've got a bright sky, and then you've got some deep shadow underneath the bridge here. And so there's details, obviously, that got obscured. But because we do have good dynamic range in this sensor, you have the ability to really pull open those shadows basically as much as you want. And you can see that there's a little bit of fine noise that's been added in here. But overall, the image, there's no banding or anything ugly showing up. The detail still looks very good, and I've got the ability also to pull back in the sky a bit more. There's not a whole lot to recover in this particular image, so you have the latitude to really open things up there. So finally, when it comes to the high ISO performance, this is at the top of the ISO range, ISO 12,800. Autofocus definitely slowed down to get this shot because I was shooting not quite a dark room, but an extremely dim room. And you can see here, looking at the image as a whole, that there certainly is some visible noise pattern here, but it doesn't look terrible. There's not any kind of color banding or patches. The primary kind of negative that I see, that if I look in close, is that you've got some scattered like hot pixels there, and so the shadow information isn't as good as what I would love to see. But you can see that the detail is held up really nicely. That's not a problem here at all, and so this is still what I would consider a usable image, even if there is a look to it that is the result of that kind of grain that is everywhere. An easy way to fix that is to just choose one of these monochrome conversions, and you can see that there are still a few of those hot pixels that show up here and there, but the overall look of the grain is pretty natural here for a monochrome conversion. And so I think that at high ISO, if you don't mind shooting monochrome, they still look pretty cool to my eye.
As always, thanks for watching to the very end. If you've absorbed all of this, I hope it has helped you to make an informed decision about the X100VI. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.